Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Gary Gindanami, Beherbe, welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station. My name is Andy. Coming to you for the last time, for now, from Bashur, the southern part of Kurdistan, the northern part of Iraq. Next week, I will be back in the 4ZZZ studios there on Yagaran Turrbal country. But it has been an interesting stint here. But anyway, today on the show, we are going to be talking about democracy. Of course, there is an election coming up in Australia at some point in the next few months. And there has just been one in Western Australia last weekend. Elections, they certainly serve a purpose, and I think we're better off with them than we would be without them. But when it comes to the feeling of democracy, they're not necessarily the most empowering kind of thing when you go to vote. Often it's with a kind of grudging resentment that this is the best we can do, is put in these votes for a system that we don't really feel represents us that well. Well, one person who's thought a lot about this is Tim Hollo, who is an author. He does a few different things. There's a website called Green Agenda that Tim plays a large part in running. He writes for it, but also I think sort of curates it, where people can write sort of analyses of our systems, really trying to dig in deep to get some of the answers that we don't find in our normal political discourse in the news. He also was part of a thing called Green Music, which is quite interesting. But what we're going to be talking to him about today is this idea of democracy and different forms of democracy that could transform maybe our political system, definitely the involvement of everyday people in our political system. And Tim has written a book called Living Democracy, an ecological manifesto for the end of the world as we know it, is a subtitle. And in it, he explores this thing, democracy, what it means, what are some of the flaws with our current system for how we enact it, and what are some different alternatives that could be more inclusive, more empowering of everyday people, and potentially could transform the way our society looks if we gave more people a say over both the big issues and the small day-to-day issues of our lives. I think many of us agree that we're up for a bit of a change in political systems around the world. There's quite a shaking up of democracy with a lot of sort of authoritarian right-wing parties getting a lot of votes and attention, but also parties from the left. A lot of minor parties in Australia and around the place showing people sort of disenchantment with established powers in our democracy. And so maybe the time is ripe for talking about some of these changes. Of course, big systemic changes, they seem so hard to enact. But I guess one of the things about grassroots democracy, as we'll talk about with Tim Hollo, is that it's grassroots. You can start from wherever. And so it's a very interesting chat. We cover a lot of ground. I got up early in the morning, my time here, to have a chat with him, but it was well worth it. And so let's get into it now.
My name's Tim Hollo. I'm the Executive Director of the Green Institute, and I'm an environmental activist, a community organiser, an activist, a musician, a writer, a parent, all sorts of things.
I am interested in talking about one of your books, which is called Living Democracy. And it's an interesting concept at any time. I think now as well, we're especially realising the importance of democracy. And so could you start off by telling us a bit about what is the concept behind living democracy?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the book emerged from, my many years of experience kind of working for environmental action and social change, for social justice, and, finding more and more that kind of the mechanisms that we have been told to trust, basically, the democratic mechanisms for getting change for the better in this world, were not really very effective and getting less and less and less effective. What my analysis kind of started to go to, obviously kind of critiques of the intertwining of capitalism and government, and the intertwining of kind of coercive power and the way government works, and really kind of a deeper and deeper critique of the democratic systems that we have today, that we think of as permanent, really, and we're told to think of as permanent and the only way things can happen. And more, with all of the reading that I was doing, I was coming to this kind of analysis of actually our democratic systems are kind of deadening and increasingly kind of dead, looking dead. They're not really breathing, they're not alive. And the idea of living democracy kind of started to emerge in my head, learning a lot from a whole lot of really important thinkers like Murray Bookchin and Elinor Ostrom and Hannah Arendt and many, many others, that actually what we need is an ecological kind of view of what we want from our democracy and how democracy can work. So this idea of living democracy is kind of a multi-layered idea there, that we need a democratic system that is alive and breathing. We need a democratic system that learns from living systems, in that it learns from ecological wisdom and understandings of ecology, that health and beauty come from diversity and come from interdependence, and that kind of interaction of interdependence and diversity, which creates change, the changeability, flexibility, permutations in the way the world works. And living in the third sense, that it needs to be active. We need to live democracy into being. So it's kind of that triple layer of understanding. We need together as a diverse and interdependent community to start living into being this living idea of democracy, which will enable us to live together in a time which is increasingly kind of scary and challenging.
The word democracy can mean a lot of things. Of course, in the US, there's been wars for democracy in other places, of imperial wars, some would say. And of course, in Australia, we have an election coming up at some point, if it ever gets called. How do you differentiate the democracy you're talking about from these other ways the word is used?
Yeah, that's a really good point, particularly, in the face of an election coming up in Australia. I think a lot of us have been sort of brought up in this culture that we equate elections with democracy. And that's kind of, when people talk about democracy, we think about elections. And I think it's really important that we see elections as often one part of democracy, but in some ways not even the most important part, and in some ways not even the best part. Democracy simply means people power, literally. It means a system of governance where people get to make the decisions about what happens. And there's all sorts of different ways of encapsulating that and making that a reality. The democratic system that we have today in Australia is one where we have an incredibly a really, really fantastic electoral system. Genuinely, we have one of the best electoral systems and most trustworthy electoral systems in the world, bolted on to a really remarkably weak democracy, actually, where the excellence of our electoral system kind of blinds us to the fact that we don't have much of a say in the decisions which shape our lives very much at all. And so, I explore with living democracy, ideas of participatory democracy, where citizens and residents and people in communities get together to make decisions collectively about the way we live our lives. I also explore not just participation, but deliberation, which I think is a really, really crucial aspect of it. And what deliberation means is you can think of it kind of in contrast to the really adversarial democratic system and governance system that we have in our parliaments, where what you see is basically people fighting over their particular views until one of them wins. Deliberation is a radically different way of decision making, where people sit down together around a table or whatever it is, come together and discuss and think through and listen to each other and learn from each other and understand a bit better where you're coming from. And in that process, you can be incredibly creative and you can work out together a good way of making sure that everybody comes out of the conversation relatively satisfied with the decision that's been made. So there's all sorts of models of democratic practice. For me, living democracy and the democracy that we need to start cultivating and living into being at this moment in history is one where every voice can be heard, every voice can participate, every voice is listened to, and together, deliberatively, creatively, generously, we work out ways to go forward together, paths to walk together into this future.
So can you share with us some of the models of what these participatory democracy or deliberative democracy would look like in practice?
Yeah, there's all sorts of different ways. I like to, in terms of imagining it, I like to sort of give an example of, for instance, if you think about how you make a decision, if you're in a group of people, how you make a decision about where you're going for dinner. Say you've got a group of 10 people. In the electoral model, you would literally, everybody casts a vote. And then you make a decision based on that. And in some models, you would need to get to 50%. In some models, just whatever. If 4 people vote for pizza and 3 for kebabs and 2 for Thai, the 4 votes for pizza wins. Despite the fact that maybe the pizza place doesn't have good vegetarian options or good gluten-free options or halal options or whatever, minorities don't really actually get a say. There's no kind of creative thinking in there. Usually when we're trying to work out together in a group of 10 people where we're going to eat our meal, we'll actually have a conversation about it and we'll work out what are the needs of this group of people. Does somebody need a halal meal, even if it's only one person? Does somebody need good gluten-free or vegetarian options? And then we kind of think creatively together, okay, well, this is going to be the option and maybe it's going to be completely different. Maybe we go for dumplings or something. And it's not one of the original proposals. So, that's a way of imagining ourselves into it. And there's all sorts of really fantastic models of that out there. A lot of people have probably heard or come across or even participated in a citizens' assembly. And in Australia, that's a model which is starting to be, used more frequently as a way of getting through difficult questions, difficult challenges. It's been used, for instance, quite effectively in South Australia, to think through the political challenges of the question of nuclear waste dumps, for instance, which led to a decision that the government was not expecting and didn't want, but did follow through on, where the community together had decided, actually, you know what, we don't think this is a good idea. We don't think we should go ahead with it. There's also kind of less formally, in a sense, the kitchen table conversation model, which led to what became the Voices for Indi, which led to Cathy McGowan being elected as the member for Indi and then handing over to Helen Haynes successfully at an election, which is, where members of a community in small groups will get together and just really quite openly talk about what is it that we value in our community? What's good here? What do we want to focus on and to improve? What do we want to kind of let go and leave behind? And in small groups, they come together and tease those questions out, and then those ideas are gathered together across groups of groups, and you discuss further, and over time, with a whole lot of kitchen table conversations and then larger collective conversations, you get to a point of a community at large being able to say, hey, this is what we think matters, this is what we think is important, and then kind of almost incidentally selecting a candidate to run for election who then becomes their delegate into federal parliament. That's a really interesting model. At the really kind of radical end, which I know you're very much across, is the multi-ethnic, feminist and ecological non-state governance of Kurdistan, of Rojava in Syria, the deep democratic experiment of learning from Murray Bookchin's democratic confederalism, where communities are self-governing and then you confederate those communities so that you can scale governance not by growing it bigger, but by actually kind of having collectives of collectives, groups of groups that together coordinate their hyperlocal self-governance. There's so many different models. Some of them kind of really obviously like government, some of them not like government at all, whether it be sort of suburban decision-making around, can we get a group together to do some bush regeneration or some community agriculture going, which we don't think of as democracy, but absolutely is democratic.
I guess one of the things with our somewhat impersonal model at the moment on a national scale is that it does have to be very large if you're going to make decisions on that kind of scale, and so I wonder about the question of how to scale up these models that are maybe a bit more inefficient.
Well, they're inefficient in capitalist terms. And I think what a lot of us are starting to recognise, and a lot of economists are starting to recognise, is that efficiency in capitalist terms benefits powerful people at the top who own and get the profits from those kinds of systems. That efficiency doesn't benefit the rest of us. It doesn't benefit the ecosystems. It doesn't benefit the people who are putting the value into the things that the owners of that capital are getting the profit from. So it really kind of depends on whose efficiency you're thinking about. The brilliant Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics for her work on understanding and valuing common pool resources, things that we think of as like, natural ecosystems or, pieces of, urban landscape or whatever that we need to share, really demonstrated that in fact the most efficient way of managing common pool resources is by the communities who use them and who are most directly affected to make those decisions at that local level, and then to kind of collectively manage the large scale across those groups. So, for instance, she did a lot of work on large river systems, really enormous river systems. What's the best way to manage a river system, like, for instance, the Murray-Darling, and demonstrated pretty conclusively that what our, capitalist, imperialist kind of hierarchical system deems as an efficient way of managing that from top-down centralised management is really inefficient and really ineffective and tends to damage that system in such a way that nobody gets the benefit. Whereas if you have small local communities managing their piece of that river system, this little ecological community here, this little farming system around the river system there, each of those communities managing their own system for its health and their collective use, and then coming together as a collective of collectives, sharing what they're learning, cooperating, learning from each other, and determining together across their collective of collectives how to manage that river system. That's much, much more efficient, in fact, in terms of everybody, including the river system itself and the non-human inhabitants of that river system, actually getting the benefit of it. So yeah, that kind of top-down hierarchical capitalist idea of efficiency is incredibly inefficient, and I think more and more of us are kind of coming to recognise how that's the case. And it opens up a whole brand new space of thinking for us.
In your book, in the subtitle, you talk about the solutions for the ecological emergency that we find ourselves in. I guess, how do you see that correlation between these more grassroots democratic approaches and a solution to a very large-scale problem like climate change and our other ecological crises?
Yeah, like many of us, I've grown up in this world where we're told, oh, it's a global crisis and it needs a global response. And I certainly believed that for a very long time myself. And, I've been involved in campaigning for climate action since the last millennium, since the late 1990s. And we had faith that, this global United Nations system of governance would somehow work out how to solve this crisis. And I think one of the things that's become increasingly clear to me is that it has proven itself incapable of doing so. This idea that a global political system that's made up of kind of governments of sovereign states, only a handful of which are kind of even pretend to be democratic, frankly, would somehow solve this global problem. And yes, I think what I'm coming to recognise, I guess, learning from so many others, learning from Ostrom, learning from Bookchin, learning, it must be said, from indigenous systems of governance as well, is that the best way to find solutions to a global crisis is for each community to do it for themselves and to work out together how that's going to happen. Yes, climate change is a global crisis, and we can learn how to do our part in our local community. We need to transform global energy systems, and the way we transform global energy systems is for our little community to transform our own and to share what we're doing and what we're learning about it from the community next door. I went at the end of last year to help celebrate the 10th birthday party of Totally Renewable Yakandanda, small town in regional Victoria, which has chosen collectively to just go 100% renewables and to do it themselves, community-owned, community-run renewable energy and battery cooperative that they've built there, transforming their own community utterly from the grassroots up. They've done it themselves reasonably quickly. They can then share what they've learned with the town next door, with the suburb of Wangaratta, just up the road, with Canberra or Melbourne not too far away. And each of our communities can learn how to do it ourselves. And if we take ownership of that, ownership for ourselves, for our local communities, but also for our piece of the global ecosystem, that transformation can happen incredibly effectively, incredibly fast, and incredibly justly, fairly, in a manner which shares the benefits of that action across all of our communities. Where our wealthier communities can do it faster, we can then support both, financially and with our learnings and our ideas with those who might have less financial wherewithal to do it. That kind of transformation can happen much faster, and it hasn't happened, from this top-down global management. I've been told so many times by kind of these big important figures, in the climate movement, this kind of transformation from the grassroots you're talking about. We don't have time for that. We've got this global crisis. We need to deal with it at a global level. Well, how's that going? It's failed. It's absolutely failed. We need to recognise that top-down approach is not working. to solve this global crisis. And the only path that genuinely does hold promise to solve the global crisis is the small-scale, grassroots-up, collective, and then confederating, collecting our collectives in a global manner.
What other flow-on effects would you see as coming from this kind of local transformation?
Oh, so many, and in so many different directions. This is one of the beauties of it. I was having a fascinating conversation just yesterday with a friend who pointed me to some really interesting research which showed that, one of the defining features of kind of successful democratic communities, one of the really interestingly kind of measurable local kind of, local aspects of a community, which is likely to lead to it being effectively democratic, is the participation in community choirs in that community. It's literally, that kind of thing. The more people are involved in doing fun things together and enjoying their lives together. Sometimes it's musical, sometimes it's growing food together, sometimes it's bush regeneration, sometimes it's educating kids, sometimes it's health-based, looking after each other. This kind of approach is about learning to live well together and enjoying that process. There's so much joy that comes from being part of a community that does local food well together, where you see, yes, some reasonably formal, perhaps, community gardens where people come together, but also people, where you've got communities where quite a few people kind of grow food in their own backyards, but then they exchange it. They swap it with each other. I've got too many zucchinis. Do you want some of these zucchinis? I know what I can do with zucchinis. I can pickle some of them, or I can make a cake, and I'm going to give that back to you, or share it on with somebody else who might have too many eggs for them to use themselves. That shared energy that develops with this kind of work is pure happiness, it's pure joy. So there's so many shared benefits that come with this approach. And in fact, often it starts with that sort of work. When people are doing that, when people are actively, this is kind of what I mean by the living democracy, when people are living that stuff into being, that's when they actually also then come together and say, hey, you know what? We could make decisions together. We could form a community assembly to actually do this work together and start to institutionalize it a little bit, instead of relying on a global political system and a global economic system which is making us unhealthy, which is making us unhappy, which is making us constantly busy, which is making us constantly second guess ourselves and doubt our own capacity to make change, doubt our own capacity to kind of be able to help each other in our own lives. There's just so much beauty and joy and satisfaction to be gained from this approach. Particularly, one of the things that I see a lot, I've got, adolescent kids. I've spent a lot of time over recent years with young folk, and the disempowerment twined with the anxiety and fear about the state of the world, twined with the general kind of, mental health challenges that young people often face, all of these things kind of working together make for a tremendous amount of unhappiness and dissatisfaction. When you work out how to kind of solve these crises together, it's so powerful, and it creates so much joy and happiness and satisfaction.
It's interesting having critiques of our current democratic institutions, which of course are well founded, in this current moment where those institutions are sort of under attack, particularly for what we're watching in the US, but also around the world. There is this dissatisfaction with these democratic institutions, which have been really hard fought over the years, and obviously represent such a step up in equality from, you know, what we had before of feudal systems or whatever. And so I wonder how you feel about that, about critiquing these institutions while at the same time trying to protect them from something worse that might be coming.
Oh, that's such an important point, and it's something that I've been really kind of grappling with myself and having really, you know, big conversations with folks about. It is a huge challenge, and it's one of those moments where I think we need to work out kind of how to step into our courage in this space. What we're seeing, I think it's really obvious in Europe in some ways, almost more so than it is in America, and certainly more so than it is here in Australia. The efforts of kind of large coalitions of the centre left and kind of progressive forces increasingly kind of focused on protecting existing institutions are actually backfiring. They're backfiring really badly. Because, yes, you're right. Of course, we've fought, and our ancestors have fought incredibly hard for these institutions. And it's difficult for us then to kind of grapple with the fact that those institutions are failing. And they are failing. The reason more and more people are starting to look with interest at the authoritarian far right is because they're quite right that the institutions are failing. They're quite right that these systems of government that were supposed to protect us, that were supposed to keep us kind of safe and reasonably prosperous, and doing well and being able to look forward to the future, those institutions are failing. And the right, ironically, is doing a better job at the moment of exposing that. They're doing a better job at identifying that fact and kind of validating people's feelings that those institutions are failing. Then what they're doing is a really nasty, incredibly dishonest bait and switch. They're sucking people in with, yes, we understand, you're right, these systems aren't working. And what you should do now is blame this particular scary other over there, whether it's immigrants or, you know, LGBTQI plus people, or blame those dole bludgers, those hippie environmental protesters. It's their fault. And that's incredibly dishonest and it's incredibly destructive. But it's based on an accurate diagnosis that people are right when they say these institutions aren't working. They're not working for people. And when you have left and progressive reformist parties who are spending a lot of their time at the moment defending a status quo which people quite rightly don't invest their trust in anymore, it's actually backfiring. And it's, you know, what we've seen in Germany in this last month, I think, is a really stark example of that. You know, a progressive coalition government that was promising to improve life for people and was failing to do so, not because they weren't trying, but because the institutions of government kind of are sclerotic. They're not really working anymore. And so you can't get the benefit through those systems. And so people then go, well, what about the fascists? Maybe they'll do something about it. It's the wrong answer, but it's the right question. And I think it's really important for us to kind of, at this moment in history, kind of go, take a deep breath. Where are we? These institutions were important. They brought a lot of benefit in so many ways to a lot of people over several generations. Now they're not working anymore. What happens next? Where do we go from here? How do we work collectively for our common benefit? Not in a way which, as the far right does, kind of shuts down and says, how can we work for the common benefit of this small group of people who look alike and think alike, and exclude and possibly be violently exclusive towards people who don't look like us and think like us and behave like us. But actively, how do we bring in other voices? How do we think about how what's good for us can be good for everyone else? And in fact, none of us will ever be able to have a good life until everyone has a good life together that we can all share. That, I think, yes, it's going to take courage. It's going to take a willingness to kind of step back from a lot of what we've won institutionally and think about what we've won culturally over that time and how to take it the those next steps institutionally. And weirdly, and it's difficult to think this way, and I don't mean this in any way as to kind of say I approve of what they're doing, because it's so destructive of so many people's lives. But weirdly, what is happening in America with Trump and Musk and co., where they are taking a sledgehammer to the existing institutions, it's opening up a space for us then to wake up, take some deep breaths, splash some cold water on our faces and go, okay, what now? What now? Because we can't save those institutions. What do we do together now that will build the next set of institutions which will be better, and which are institutions that will be capable of actually appealing to the people who have been saying maybe the far right have a point?
One of the elements, I guess, that people have pointed to in this kind of change is our more technological society, and people have pointed out social media polarization and things like that as being a part of that. And at one point, people would have considered the internet and social media as these really democratizing tools. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on that, on how to respond to technology, both, you know, that exists now, but also what could be coming soon, and how to use or resist that kind of technological advances in trying to be more democratic.
Yeah, really, again, really important point. I find myself a little bit torn on it, because I personally, you know, I obviously use a lot of technology, and a lot of people around me do, and we have to. But I also really like getting offline, and I think there's tremendous value in kind of carving out those spaces in our own lives and in our communities to get offline and just to sit down together, literally with our hands in the dirt together, growing food together, whatever it is, talking face to face. There's an important space for that there, which is one aspect of it. And the technology is here. It's real. It's not going away. We need to learn how to do with it, what to do with it. And to me, the challenge that we're facing at the moment with the polarizing that's going on through social media and technological spaces is not about the technology. It's about capitalism. It's about power. And there's some really, really fantastic kind of, you know, thinking and writing being done in that space. I'm sure you and some of your listeners will be aware of Yanis Varoufakis's really important work recently on techno-feudalism, Cory Doctorow, you know, writing about choke point capitalism and technology. Cory Doctorow's beautiful, hilarious term enshittification, I think, is kind of at the core of this. And what Dr. O means by that is, if you think about kind of tech platforms, when they're first developed, they're developed for their users. And people kind of go, that's really cool. That's going to make life better for me. And it's democratizing. And it's going to help bring people together and forge new connections between people. And it works. And then the technology works to the extent that it gets a bit of venture capital funding. And then the platform gets tweaked a bit so that instead of really being there for its users, it's actually there to extract a bit of profit from its users so that the venture capitalists can get a return on their investment. And then what happens is that the platform takes advertising, and the platform's tweaked again in its structures and its algorithms so that the profits are then skewed towards going to the advertisers, and it works even less well for the users. And over time, these platforms that were tremendous technology as democratizing tools, as making life better for us, they stop working. They're enshittified, and they become this extractive capitalist machine using us, its users, as sources of value for the owners of capital, the profiteers. To me, this is the core of the problem. Technology, yes, can be an incredible tool for making our lives better, for reducing the amount of time that we have to spend doing work that we don't want to do, so that we can have more time to do the things that we do want to do, for bringing us together, for making connections, for having, you know, conversations with people all around the globe who we may never have had the opportunity to meet with, and sharing ideas with them. That's all awesome. The problem isn't the technology. The problem is capitalism. The problem is ownership and the way the value is extracted instead of shared. So if we can deal with that problem, if we can withdraw our consent from those capitalist market systems and say, we're not going to participate in those anymore. We're going to find our paths to, versions of these technologies that don't extract our value, but simply help us connect. Use those systems to help connect more and, learn more skills, get new technologies. That's the path that can use technology for liberation. And I think that's extremely exciting. As well as also, every now and then, turning it off, going and have a chat with people while digging in the ground.
Okay, well, there's many more things we could talk about, but we are running out of time. And so I guess my last question is, where should the average person start if we want to make these kind of large transformations?
Anywhere that you feel comfortable, as long as there's other people around you. This is the one thing that I kind of say to people. I'm glad you didn't ask it in these terms. Often people will kind of say, where can I do something on my own that'll have make a difference? And I say, no matter what you do, don't do it on your own. Find the other people. The beauty of this kind of approach is that as long as you're doing something which brings in other people and, creates more connections, it kind of doesn't matter what it is. It might be a sharing group. It might be repairing, sharing skills and learning new skills. It might have something to do with food, whether it's growing food or sharing food or preparing food together. It might have something to do with transport. You might have a community where your school community could benefit from a little walking school bus or cycle, commute group on the way to school and on the way home. It might be something that's really capital D democratic, where you kind of go, hey, there's an issue here in our community. Let's bring an assembly together to talk about it. And you talk about this one issue, and that leads to people exercising their democratic muscles and going, this is cool, let's do it again on something else. That's the thing for me. It doesn't matter as long as what you're doing is bringing people together and creating shared benefit where the value actually kind of gets to circulate and increases by circulating amongst people. It's doing good. And the final thing I guess I would say on that is to remember that sometimes that's going to work and sometimes it won't, and that's fine. So many of these little community ideas that crop up work for a little while, and then maybe they kind of don't work after a while. They sort of slow down. Well, for whatever reason, people lose energy or it doesn't quite work that way anymore in the community. That's fine, because change is part of ecology. And okay, so you've learnt some lessons from that and your community has learnt lessons for that. You park that, you leave it behind. Maybe it'll happen again later, or maybe you guys will move on to do something else. Relaxing about the capacity for success, I think, is really important. But yeah, there's so many paths. Whatever it is that excites you, talk to someone else about it. See if it excites them. See if you can find a group of you who want to do it together. Off you go, do it. And then connect to others. That's the beauty and the magic of it.
All right, and if people want to find out more about your ideas on democratic transformation, how can they do that?
So the easiest, as you said, is I wrote a book called Living Democracy, an ecological manifesto for the end of the world as we know it. And you can pick that book up either on paper or electronically, and I recorded an audio book of it that you can find. But there's so many fantastic ideas. In that book you'll find references to, Barcelona en Comú, to Rojava, as I mentioned, in Kurdistan, to the ideas of municipalism, which there's a tremendous amount written about online. There's, once you start down this rabbit hole, you'll find so many fantastic ideas. But yeah, I'd love it if you wanted to have a look at my book and see where those ideas then kind of take you traveling.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim, for chatting with us today.
Pleasure, Andy. Thanks for your time.
That is Tim Hollo there, and for the last hour or thereabouts, we have been talking about transforming democracy, what are some of the critiques of our current system, and what is possible in terms of alternatives. And you can read Tim's book on the subject, which he was just plugging there. Also, the website Green Agenda features quite a few articles by him and other contributors as well who have a similar worldview. And I do think, I've mentioned a couple of times, but with a federal election coming up, it is a good time to think about what our democracy is delivering for us and whether we want something more, and if we do, what that could look like. And I think in some ways that can lead to a kind of defeatism quite quickly if we think, well, we don't have power to change things on the big level. But I think thinking about the ways that we are disempowered on like a macro level from making this whole country what we might like it to be, what it might lead us to is thinking about what are ways that we can be empowered to transform our immediate communities around us, maybe just by starting projects that in our neighborhoods, in our suburbs, start to open up new possibilities for people. Maybe it's looking at ways of political involvement through sort of traditional means of joining lobby groups and activist campaigns, even political parties, things like that. Maybe it is dreaming up possibilities or educating ourselves on, radical possibilities and starting to talk to people about them and thinking about ways we can implement it. But anyway, if we just consider the extent of our democratic involvement, turning up on the day, whenever it may be, casting our ballot and then going home and watching the important people do it on TV, well, it's not very satisfying for us, and ultimately it will work to sustain the power of those who already have it stacked in their favour, and those are the people whose interests are represented currently by what we call democracy. And so one of the things that I try to do on the paradigm shift is really try to talk to people who are imagining alternatives, because it is something that we need to do. And not just total unrealistic optimism, but people who have good analysis, but who hold in their mind the possibility that what we have now is not how it always has to be. And so I'll be back next week talking about more of the same. I do hope you'll join me then. I'll see you next week.